Roundtable moderated by Eleonora. So Eleonora, you...
All the speakers are here.
Yeah, no, they're coming, but we need to start, otherwise they won't come.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final roundtable discussion of the day and of the conference. As you can see from the program, we have a number of panelists in these final sessions. There are, of course, Professor Spindler, who already presented earlier today. Then there is Andrea Marco Ricci from Nuovo Imaje, Augustin Reina from BEUC, that is a leading consumer organization and is based in Brussels. Cedric Manara, who is does not require any introduction, is a senior copyright counsel at Google. Professor Zeno Zenkovic, who is now back on the ground. He's back with us, and of course he's a well-known professor of comparative law at University Roma 3. And finally, Giuseppe Mazziotti, who is an assistant professor in intellectual property law at Trinity College Dublin. So what I would like to do in the time at our disposal is to have more like a discussion, conversation, rather than individual presentations. The discussion will be structured around a number of different themes, and I would like to invite panelists and members of the audience alike to share their views on the value gap proposal and what lies ahead for this area of copyright law. So I would like to start by asking whether there is really a value gap, because we have focused on the draft provisions, but the starting point, of course, is whether these provisions are rooted within a solid rationale and an existing problem. So I would like to ask the panelists whether there is indeed a value gap, and if so, where it does lie. I don't know who wants to take this first issue. Please. You can use Leonard's.
Yes. Do you hear me now? Wow. I may say my point of view is the point of view of the person who works on the field, not an academic. And so this is a quite different point of view. And for what is concerned about collecting in society, it is very difficult to negotiate an agreement with a huge player as Google is, or as Spotify, or as Apple, or something like that. Because of course the nationality of the copyright, divides the single collecting and helps the player in negotiating as low as possible. So that's the reason why I was asking to Professor Spindler if negotiation of a levy should be done on a European basis or not. Actually, in this moment, collecting societies are trying to stay together in sort of hubs in order to negotiate together for a bigger market, the license for the usage of the content. So for me, of course, there's a value gap. But if I can go over, looking at this directive, it seems to me that there are 2 points that you have considered, but I consider in a different way. The first of this point is that it seems to me the directive is more concentrated in the economical part of copyright and not in the moral part of copyright. Paternity right is a huge challenge today because we are digitalizing all the contents, but we are not digitalizing the name of the persons who have done this content. I mean, in music this is quite common. So the name of authors, composers, performers, which is not the main performer, I mean the session musicians, doesn't appear at all in any legal system. That represents a double problem. The first problem is, of course, the chance to lose the culture of a nation. And this cannot be protected only with public institutions that do something for cultural heritage. This must be part of the market. So I as a user should be in. There must be a way in which I can know who is behind this work, because I want to know the story of this work. As I read a book and I see the name of the author, so I shall see a video or listen to a song and know who is behind that. The fact is, one of the reasons of the paternity right is that the author or the performer can gain a reputation, then gain image for users or operators. The notice and take down clauses is a double damage in this way, because if my name doesn't appear on a content and there's a copyright violation, and their solution is to take down this content, I have a double damage, because I don't want that this content is going to take down. I just want that this content is used with my name. I want that the people knows that I'm the author or I am the performer. So notice and take down clauses is not the correct way to solve this problem. And this problem cannot be solved simply by legislation, because as you know, moral rights are personally. So just the single author can be claimed for copyright. And the single author or performer is the weaker contractual part. So if I claim to remove a content, I damage myself, and maybe I lost money, I lost visibility, and maybe this user will not use more my contents. So in this proposal, moral rights are for me not so considered. The second part of my observation is regarding databases. You all, or we all, consider that digital content ID systems are perfect. That is not true. Of course, it is impossible to recognize everything. Although there are done so many investments in make these things better, the problem is if I don't have a complete databases, I cannot recognize, because the recognition is done by a data which is recognized in the usage. So if I cannot oblige the user to ask for the data of the performer, the author, the name of the content, etc., the user will not be never able to report what has been really used. This represents for collective society a huge problem. Let me say that on April 11th, Italy has amended the Barnier Directive. And Article 23 says that a user is obliged to provide in 90 days the report of what has been used. If he has not all the data that are useful to this reconnection, he can ask for a collecting society for the data he doesn't have. And as the collecting society helps him in understanding what is the data required, he has the 90 days to provide this information. If he doesn't provide this information or provides it incompletely or incorrectly, the license will be resolved automatically. So the user will be not more able to use this content. And this will be, of course, a great problem for digital systems. The fact is the directive puts a limit in balance, as that has been said today, and that is not compulsory. The data must be sufficient, not complete. So for somebody who, like me, represents artists, that is strange, because if I want to start a new business and I have to pay employers, and I never said, oh, it's too complicated to remunerate analytically employers. Just start the business, because we have startups and we have monies to do, but okay, we can go over this problem. I may say that if somebody wants to start a new business in digital market, must have a system that completely reports data of what has been used and the name of the persons who are the owners of this data. And it's not impossible. Article 4 of this directive says something that sounds very strange for me, of course, relating another point, says that the user shall provide the name of the author, whether that is impossible. Let me take the point. So Article 4(1)(b) is accompanied by the indication of the source, including the author's name, unless this turns out to be impossible. Of course, is another matter, but to put the name of the authors is never impossible. Not now in the digital world. It's a matter of costs. It's just a matter of costs. So if YouTube, for example, wants to know what a user uploads, can generally know it. There must be a form in which you cannot upload if you don't say who is the name of the author, for example. No? Spotify will tell something like that. So you cannot afford this problem without afford the problem of naming and to have a database to that. Unfortunately, in the market we have some guilt in this, because we have 3 databases.
Thank you for highlighting that the issue is complex and goes well beyond the scope of Article 13. Let's first see whether there are any reactions from the other panelists to all this.
Oh, just an information that could be useful, maybe you not. We have 3 databases in the world. So we have an ICWC databases for musical works, an ISRC database, which is not just a database, because producers create their own ISRC, and a single phonogram can have more than 50 IRC. And the VRBD2 database, which is the database that contains the name of the performers of each phonograms. These databases are owned by Collecting Society, and there's a huge work to put this data together and to provide this data to users. So whenever the market does make anything to help users to have this data, I mean, Article 13, 14 will be quite unuseful, because there's an effort that the market must do with the users in order to reach this point. And Article 13 is quite foggy in how this could be done.
Thank you. Any reactions, comments? Please, Agustin.
Thank you very much. I don't have any legitimacy to say whether there is a value gap, whether Google should pay more for the licenses. Probably yet, but I'm nobody to judge about that. But from the constant discussions, it seems that rather than a value gap, there is a bargaining gap. Basically, particularly the music industry complaining that they cannot get as much as they would like from the licenses that are currently in place with these major platforms. But what is important is that this doesn't seem to me to be, again, a copyright issue. This is a commercial debate between two parties, closer to a contractual issue, whether, how, under which conditions these contracts have to be discussed. You know, in every single member state, we have the principle of good faith, in which the contracts have to be negotiated, but it has nothing to do with copyright as such. Of course, they are right holders, they have this economic exclusive right that they want to exploit, and they have the right to license it. But the conditions for the licensing is not a matter of copyright, it's a matter of contractual practices. But then, perhaps going back to the discussion of the panel, how to protect copyright without jeopardizing the intermediary's liability. And from a pure user perspective, the answer is simple, which is the development of attractive and affordable legal offers. So consumers are willing to pay for content. If we think of the developments in the last years around file sharing, that have decreased substantially, not because of the efforts of the industry to go after, internet service providers, but simply because Spotify, Netflix, and so on, they were much more attractive than that. So if you give consumers legal offers that are attractive and they have wide catalogs, and are competitive, of course they will choose this type of services, and they're willing to pay. And it's something that we have been saying for many, many years, but there is even evidence from the EU IPO and so on about the fact that unauthorized uploading is decreasing and the willingness to pay is increasing. So I think that the fight shouldn't be taking place in the context of copyright, but really how we can develop all these services that consumers are willing to pay for. Thanks.
Thank you. Giuseppe wants to say something?
Well, I'm sympathetic to the
Microphone is not on, I think.
I'm sympathetic to the issue that Andrea raised with regard also to the importance of the attribution right, the moral rights. I participated a few weeks ago in a conference in Glasgow where this issue was discussed, and even the US Copyright Office is actually thinking about whether moral right form of protection could be introduced in US law, and we know that US law has never recognized moral rights, at least in the statute. But going back to the main topic of the roundtable, I already expressed my skepticism for this provision, but I also expressed my opinion pretty clearly, in the sense that we don't have a clear interface between the e-commerce directive and e-commerce law. Let's say liability. Professor Huguenots was raising the issue of the absence in Europe of a unitary notion of secondary liability, the fact is that this Article 13 is trying to accomplish tasks that could have been better developed somewhere else, right? So it's not the perfect provision. At the same time, once again, I think that we should look at copyright from the value chain, including authors, individual performers. We should, even though this is not the subject matter of this conference, we shouldn't forget that in the proposal for a directive on copyright in the digital single market, we also have important steps that the Commission took with regard to the protection of the rights, the protection and remuneration of the rights of authors and performers, with an obligation that reminds me a little bit, and Professor Spindler can correct me if I'm mistaken, of the German approach in this respect, even though it's not clearly stated, even though we don't have a paternalistic approach under the directive proposal, but we still have an obligation from member states to make it sure that if the remuneration for authors and performers becomes or proves to be disproportionately low, member states have to intervene in order to provide them with a mechanism that put them in a position to gain proportionately the fee that they would be entitled to. So probably we should look at this Article 13 in order to, if the article is kept, if the article were kept in the final version of the directive. This is something to be seen. As we have seen, there are several objections. The Parliament is pretty active about that. The technology companies are saying, but not only the technology companies, but several fronts of stakeholders are saying we should not oblige devisers of these platforms to implement specific technologies. We can maybe codify a principle that, in my view, is also unnecessary if we look at the whole the legislation as a whole. But you know, we know what the purpose of Article 13 is. So there are a number of proposals that could make this provision more, I would say, easier to digest, also for the technology companies. At the end of the day, what I said in my previous intervention is that Article 13 deals about basic principle of copyright law. We might like copyright or not, but at the end of the day, as Professor Spindler said, copyright is about money. Andrea also raised the issue about the fact copyright is also about being recognized as the author of a piece of work. And so probably we should look at Article 13 together with other provisions, and then we have to be careful about the data. What Tobias told us from the perspective of Google would make the provision, you know, redundant, because Tobias also said, when Laurie Reichardt from IFPI, I know IFPI pretty well because I worked for them for a short time in the past, you know, the sources of data are normally industry related, no? Certainly, we cannot entirely trust IFPI in the same way as we cannot entirely trust the association of internet companies, in the sense that each of them institutionally pursues the interest of the industry. That's pretty much, you know, obvious, and I'm not contesting that. But I remember what Laurie Reichardt said this morning about the consumption patterns. If I want to listen to music or to watch copyright videos, copyright audiovisual work, I normally subscribe to Netflix, Spotify, and similar services, not YouTube, because YouTube, at the end of the day, when it comes to the monthly amount of time I spend as an average user, is like far, far, far less than the time I spend as a subscriber on Spotify or Netflix. So these are all things that I would have expected the impact assessment to verify in a better way. But at the same time, since I worked in Brussels, I know how difficult to gather reliable information is, because, you know, very often the European institutions rely on stakeholders, but then the stakeholder, by definition, has an interest in depicting reality in a way that is more favorable to that side of the industry. So I'm not scandalized as some of my colleagues here by the provision as such. I'm saying just that it's not an optimal intervention. At the same time, it has some justification because of the lack of alignment between the e-commerce directive and the copyright directive.
Thank you. Giancarlo, Cedric?
Yes, it's interesting because we heard three speakers, and so Agustin, you said, well, there's a bargaining power. This is the problem of the value gap. Giuseppe, you said it's about the right to remuneration of authors and performers, and you said the value is there, but the problem is the payment because of informational issues. And I think it sort of captures the debate, well, it's not exactly what you said, but it's what I heard. What I mean is that when we at Google, we are really at the center of this debate. People look at us when they discuss this issue of value gap. But the thing is, it's really different depending on who speaks of what. I mean, it comes from the music industry. It comes from a handful of producers who believe they don't make enough money. But actually, if you look at money flows, if you look at the overall picture, Article 13 is not just about music and YouTube. It's about all hosting providers and all kind of content. We have other platforms. If you look at Play apps, where people can download apps to put on their Android phone, in 1 year, we've paid 7 billion with a B, 7 billion to developers, to programmers. I mean, that is a lot of money going from one place to another without the intimidation of collecting societies, by the way. So we know exactly that it's going to the actual authors of these. That's one example. We expanded Google Book Search into a platform where book publishers can actually store their books, can show chapters of the books, and people who are interested can buy the books, and they follow a link and they buy the books. I mean, we have made books publishers happy with that when they were really angry, basically, with Google Books. So if you look at, the different business models that exist and the different kind of rights holders who exist, there are many who are really happy. And you also have to look at those who don't want to make money. Here I'm speaking of Flickr, for example. There are 800 million photos on Flickr, 100 million being posted under a Creative Commons license. It means most of the people who use them don't want to monetize what they do. And this is also part of what creativity and the internet is. So regulating, starting from the value gap to just look at the music industry and some platforms is probably not the good starting point. Now, if you look at the figures, there was this person from IFPI this morning who was speaking. He said, well, 50% of our revenues of the recording industry is now coming from digital. 50%. It was less last year. It was even less the year before. So yes, if you look at the starting point of the value gap campaign, there was this problem. But if you look at 2025, in 8 years' time, there will be a substantial growth thanks to both subscription-based music streaming and ad-funded music streaming. And this is also what you see, where you see the figures. Maybe as of today, there's an issue, but when we look at the future, it's also growing. So it also depends on who you're looking at, which rights holders, which period of time you're speaking of, etc. So when you look at this, I'm not going to throw again all the figures we have, how much we pay to the music industry. You've heard this many times, but this is one of the issues we have when we as a company, we hear about this value gap issue. It's which problem do I need to fix? Because paying more money, everyone wants to have more money. We've never seen anyone in Brussels lobby to say, well, it's enough. We have enough money now. You can stop doing this. So everyone would like to have more, but what is the right amount? To whom, etc.? What's the right business model? So this is what also makes us uncomfortable. We have licenses. We have licenses with thousands of publishers on YouTube, which is quite unknown. We do have this. We remain the center of this campaign, which is YouTube doesn't pay enough. So it's hard to deal with all this. So I just want to mention this is the lack of definition of value gap, or the lack of understanding of what it is, makes it impossible to address it either from a business perspective and probably more from a policy perspective. So I would encourage anyone to say, well, what is the value gap issue? What does that mean?
Thank you. Just to move a bit forward in the discussion, some of the supporters of this value gap proposal are making as an argument that some hosting providers are hiding behind the safe harbor regime. How would you address that?
Well, maybe it happens. if you're looking at, where this campaign started from, YouTube and the music industry, again, so repeat it, we have licenses with thousands of publishers, with all relevant collecting societies, and when we didn't get one, Professor Spindler mentioned that for years in Germany, we didn't have an agreement with GEMA, so what happened? There were no music videos in Germany, period. So is this hiding behind safe harbors? No, we wanted to go beyond. We wanted to provide a good user experience, which means that we wanted to pay for music so that the content is not taken down. That's the choice we've made on YouTube. So either we said, well, the content can be taken down, or it should stay there. If it stays there, if it's our choice, we must take a license. So we discussed with relevant people, they granted us license, except in Germany. We didn't have a license in Germany, no music in Germany. Is this hiding behind a safe harbor? No. We just respected the law. So, this is pointless. It's not a discussion to have. We are not hiding behind safe harbors, at least at YouTube.
Thank you. Any comments, Giancarlo?
I just very briefly want to add up on a very important point that Augustine made before. And I want to just close it with a doctrinal reference. There is a very nice book from Adrian Jones, Piracy, the Intellectual Property Wars from Gutenberg to Gates, and the guy is arguing there that actually piracy is how market evolves. And piracy is raising when markets doesn't offer users what they're looking for. I read a line to you. Counterfeiters are only so widespread because of the exorbitant price of original edition, a price which is in itself the result of privileges. This was the Marquis de Condorcet in 1776. So it seems we didn't move very much forward since that very point in time. If users don't get what they're looking for and there is a market failure, we are going to have piracy. So the problem is that the first level on which we have to intervene is to offer the users what they're looking for. I give you one big example. It is wholly impossible to watch some live stream sport events lawfully in most jurisdictions. I have been traveling for multiple years for most of my life, and it was impossible to watch lawfully Serie A football games, for example. The same happens to legal offering of movies, TV shows, because of the copyright constriction. So, how do we intervene? We offer what lawfully, first, we offer what users are looking for on a lawful basis.
Agustin?
Yeah, indeed, it's spot on, and the fact that we have to make the legal offers accessible to consumers, that could apply, for example, create the conditions for the development of such offers. For example, we have Article 10 of the Copyright Directive, of the proposed directive, on facilitating the acquisition of license for video-on-demand platforms for audiovisual content, just to give you an example. So, create tools at national level to help the acquisition of licenses, by startups that eventually want to develop a legal service. The question of geo-blocking, we have discussed it for many years, and it's exactly one of the biggest problems of the audiovisual industry. While consumers have to go through the struggles of trying to find a link that works and is not going to be taken down 3 minutes after the match have started. Why don't in the first place develop something that people can pay and are willing to pay, and we know they're willing to pay for that. But when you talk to the industry, no. Then you want to destroy culture in Europe if you give access to people to things that they're willing to pay for. So this dichotomy in the whole narrative. Nevertheless, are some initiatives that are quite interesting. For example, the EU is working in a project called Agorateca, which means basically creating aggregators at a national level in which consumers would eventually be able to find the content that they're looking for, and then they will have a link to the relevant legal offer. So there are tools that can be used without necessarily having to go through these very hardcore measures.
Giuseppe?
No, when it comes to the availability of legitimate content services, well, I think we have already reached a very, very high and abundant offer. Even though I agree with you that it's frustrating that we still have these limitations on a territorial basis, but there are quite so many arguments in order to keep geo-blocking alive, unfortunately. We don't have a comparable purchasing power. We have a different different market conditions. I wrote a couple of papers about that, and hearing from the stakeholders, this digital single market is still a utopian in many ways, no? Well, in many ways, when it comes to content, it is, for several reasons. We have a very fragmented copyright scenario. We don't have a European copyright system. We don't have a demand for pan-European exploitations. If we want to say nice things just for the consumers because it's cool, fair enough. But when we look at the analysis of markets that producers have to make, we have to be serious. Because otherwise, no. Otherwise it becomes like it's very popular to say geo-blocking is not cool, we should remove it. Because it's too easy. And too easy explanations are never good. No, it's too easy.
We were in the same room as all the right holders of the youth in the audiovisual industry on the cross-border page decades, and the arguments have not taken into account by any means, the real intention of consumers when accessing content cross-border. And nevertheless, it's not about pan-European, develop a pan-European licensing. We have different steps before reaching there.
Well, we are going through these steps. I think that even though it's very, very modest, the portability regulation which is being approved is okay, at least for short-term migrants. We have, the judgments of the Court of Justice which are considerably narrowing the room for maneuver for licensors. We have the Commission monitoring what the Hollywood studios and the big broadcasters do in Europe. We might have the liberalization of passive sales when it comes to the internet in a way that from Spain or Portugal, I might be entitled very soon to access a package that contractually is limited to the UK. So in many ways, we are seeing an erosion of territoriality when it comes to copyright. But we should not disregard the fact that, we don't have yet a demand for pan-European exploitations because the market conditions are not uniform enough. So I'm not the advocate of geo-blocking, I don't like it, but at the same time we have to look at how content is produced. This is the same kind of claim that both the Hollywood studios and the small and independent European producers do. So I think we have to be cautious. I think we have already changes in the market which are promising in my view. The real issue in my view, hearing your comments, is that creators at the end of the day are not earning enough. So if the issue is not very much value gap, I would say transfer of value. Because I'm very much, Google is a company I like very much. It made an effort also to build an additional market. What Cedric was saying, YouTube is providing an additional market, but there are other platforms that are not making significant efforts in this respect. And this is precisely what we were discussing with Professor Spindler about. There is no Facebook representative here, but I've never heard of Facebook getting a license for anything. And this is frankly a scandal in my view.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Professor Zano-Zenkovic, what is your general view of all these issues?
Well, I went up there because I wanted to preach on you. No, I'm not joking. I was starting from the title of the conference, which is European Copyright Quo Vadis. Now, maybe most of you know where the whole Quo Vadis comes from. It's Peter who escapes, he's fleeing from Rome where there's a persecution, and he's on the Appia Antica and he meets Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ says, Quo Vadis, that's said in Roman, dovai. I mean, that's more or less, that's what he was saying, and said, well, and so Peter and he turned his heels, went back to Rome and was crucified. Now, I don't know if this is what the whole idea is, that sort of copyright should, go back and get crucified by some pagans who are in Brussels. Now, apart from this jest, what I would like to focus is what I have read, but maybe it's one of the many ways of reading the proposal which we have been examining in these 2 days is something quite different. You can analyze various aspects of this proposal of directive, and you can agree with one aspect or disagree with another. We can do a piecemeal approach, and obviously we have many various opinions. I would like to try to have a general look to the whole directive and what does it mean in a certain view. And at least I see the history of copyright as a long history in which for at least 2 centuries, we have, well, starting from Queen Anne's Act, it is exclusive right to publishers, then we have the French revolutionary text which gives status to authors. Then at the last quarter, 30 years of the 20th century, copyright changes radically as a legal entitlement of cultural entertainment and innovation undertakings. Why innovation? Because of software, which is a Software Copyright Act of 1980, and then all the subsequent consequences. What happens with this, at least I'm not prophesizing, I'm not up there, but I'm not going to say that this is what is the evil which will come upon us and you sinners, but what is the whole, how I see it, looking at having white hair and having seen what's been going on in Brussels for the last, well, at least 30 years, we are moving from copyright to something which is completely different, significantly different, which is the regulation of industry, which is not much different from the regulation of other regulated industries: telecommunications, transport, financial services, energy. So if we look at the problem not from a copyright perspective, but from a regulatory perspective, and this I think is the whole gist of the proposal of directive, we ask ourselves, I ask myself, I'm not saying I'm in agreement or disagreement, I'm just trying to look at things how they appear to me. Maybe I don't like them, but that is quite immaterial. So what do we have? When we start looking at a regulated market, we start establishing, first thing, who is part of this market? So this is, how do you enter this market? And if you look in this proposal of directive, you start saying definition of publisher. This is a definition of typically regulatory definition. And then you find a whole lot of other indications of who are the members of this, who are the entities which are regulated entities, and how you enter the regulated market. Then how this market is organized, upstream and downstream. So this is very important, and it's very important from obviously various aspects, because we know how many problems there are which are beyond copyright. Obviously it has very much to do with contractual agreements, but not only with structural agreements, with regulation of networks, how you distribute, and the regulation of networks obviously influences what is the way you organize this market. So we must see how this market is regulated upstream and downstream. Then we look at, and this is very interesting, and I mean, we've been working on this for ages, general and special competition rules. To what extent this proposal of directive represents an exception to general competition rules and to a certain general principles. We know that competition law is not equal for each sector. We know that in each sector there are some specific competition rules, so we should look at what are the specific competition rules that we apply in this vast area of this new, let's call it a new regulated market. Obviously, then if you're looking at a regulated market, we look at general welfare effects. We're interested in that. Welfare effects are both economic and both social, and we will look at that. We sort of we've forgotten about copyright. We're just looking at I mean, the fact that I can go on Google, that is a welfare effect. I can get any information and find any information I want on Google. That is a welfare effect. It is considered important for a society. Even I'm not on Facebook, and I rather detest Facebook, but Facebook is also a welfare effect. I mean, you pay for what you for the activity you do on Facebook. But just to show, we are entering this very different dimension, and then consumer protection. Consumer protection, in this case, we are talking of user protection. I mean, for me, user consumer, it's the weaker party of this relation. As we know, online, it's all contractual activity. When we go on so-called free services, if they are free and we're not paying, we're just paying with our data. So it's a contract. There's no doubt, at least from my point of view, no doubt about that we are paying for the service. When I go on Google and I do a search, I'm paying with the data I provide on myself, on the kind of research which enables Google to perform better and to give better replies to the kind of questions that are presented. And then we have also in this regulated market, we have independent regulatory authorities. So if you look in the draft directive, we already see that there is the embryo of a regulatory authority which should somehow control and see in the fairness of agreements and so on. Just to point out that we are bringing in some kind of regulatory authority in this field, which I don't know exactly, is it the digital markets, how we should call it, but surely it is a regulated market. And then obviously we have problems of procedures and sanctions, notice and take down, and so on. So just to point out, I would like to give a different perspective. If we think, I mean, I'm old and I sort of brought up in a certain copyright environment. And so, you know, if we think of that kind of idea, that is, I mean, that's being crucified. It's being crucified in Brussels, and that's the end of it. So let's try to understand if we have to go towards a regulated market, then let's talk seriously about a regulated market. Let's start discussing how this regulated market works and all these various aspects which are typical of a regulated market, and not so much of very nice and high-level classical issues of copyright, which seem to me completely disregarded from a practical point of view, not from a theoretical point of view, but completely disregarded in Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zeno-Zenkovic. Now, if we move to the details of the proposal, at least the formulation issued by the Commission, I would like to invite all the panelists to pick just one element of the proposal that they deem to be either the best or the most problematic. Let's start from Cédric.
So the best in Article 13, I don't see any. Do you want me to comment on the worst?
So it is an easy choice. Nothing. Then the worst.
The worst, man. It's. I would take just one, but it really there's so many that are problematic. But if you start reading the text, we as a platform must take licenses. Okay, this is what comes from the first part of the article. The thing is, where do I get licenses from? And if I want licenses for professional music, I know where I can get them. And by the way, I have them already. Mm-hmm. But if I want to have licenses for everything that's just on one of my platforms, which is YouTube, how do I get this? The design on the T-shirt, where do I clear the rights? And I'm supposed to clear the rights for every single piece of content of every still image on every video? How do I do this? I mean, there's no one-stop shop. I can't clear the rights. So even if I want to comply, I can't. So if the article is, passes as is, we have to remove content just because we can't get licenses on it. So this is, again, if you want to be absolutely legalistic and follow it, you can't. And by the way, I'm speaking of a company which has a decent number of lawyers. So we have a clearinghouses. We have a lot of people working on licenses, and we don't know how to do this. So that's us. So imagine for all the platforms we have, and imagine for all platforms that exist out there. Everyone will have this problem. So, I mean, what's worst is that this very provision is a problem for all hosting providers that operate in Europe, period.
Thank you. Professor Spindler? The topic, if you had to pick one element of the Commission's proposal on the value gap, you are free to choose either the best one or the worst one. Which would that be?
Well, if you don't see a value gap beforehand, then it's difficult to say there's something in there. Okay, let's be a little bit more positive on that. And I think, contrary to what my friend Cedric already said, it could also be a chance for Google in order to develop new technologies which can then be sold to third parties, Content ID. So this could be, let's say, something at stake in it, or it could be that subsidized by states, I don't know, open source programs, anything like that. So I see there is a chance. The provision itself, for me, it's totally, as my colleagues already pointed out, it's totally contrary to the e-commerce directive. But frankly, we have to do something about the e-commerce directive in general, because it doesn't provide for any incentives. The ones who are doing nothing at all, they are privileged. We're not talking about here about Google or anything like that. We are talking about the bad guys in the market, and they are privileged as well. And so what I'm missing in general is a discussion about what Bernd already pointed out in that PhD thesis, the basics of negligence, of tort law, etc. And there is an economic rationale behind that, what we introduced for more than centuries or more than thousands of years, and that there are incentives to avoid damages, etc. So this kind of safe harbor of privilege is something typical for industry which is developing. You can see it also back in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, if we're talking about railways, cars, etc. You have the same development, sometimes a little bit more rapid, sometimes not. And I think now we are reaching, with all these big players like Google, we are reaching a phase that we can talk once again about introducing some sort of negligence. It should not be, say, total liability for negligence, but maybe some good Samaritan privilege, etc. And Google would benefit of that because, well, they are advanced. And startups, unfortunately, they would have a problem there. But then also, if you look at the open source movement and everything like that, it is highly probable that something will develop also, you see, and that way. And what I'm, let's say, against, and for that reason, I'm absolutely not a friend of this DSM package, that we have some sort of blocking in mind, concerning to conceive new models, as I told you already before, concerning levies, but probably going ahead of that. So, well, this is not really answering your question, I know, but, well, let's say it's a vision, like what we had at the lunch. I had a dream. I had a dream that something could work out, and moreover, okay, some little bit of advertising now. I'm also the head of the German Association of Co- and Self-Regulation of the Internet Industry, and we are now extending that to Europe. And this could be a good approach. Also with the representative stakeholders, it's not only an industry club, just to develop fine-tunes for different branches and different problems, solutions, and not to have a carved out all solution. One size doesn't fit all, in that sense. Well, okay, so advertising block finished, sorry.
Thank you. Other views from Agustin?
I would say that from consumer perspective, and as I said at the beginning, the whole debate at the end can be boiled down to the fact that there is a sector of the cultural industry that wants to basically make more money out of the platform but make them eventually liable. So if I have to compare in the value gap debate, between two provisions or two set of rules, Article 13 and Recital 38, for example, I would say that by far Article 13 is the most dangerous rule that we could think of, despite the fact that the real intention is to make a platform liable, by forcing the interpretation of the court in relation to how the e-commerce directive applies. So despite the fact of being terrible lawmaking, trying to solve an interpretative, introduce an interpretative rule in copyright, instead of doing properly in the place that it should be, which is the copyright, the e-commerce directive, because of the very scope of application of Article 13, this is what becomes the most, from a user perspective, the most dangerous provision, because eventually would apply to a video sharing platform, but would apply to any single service that is hosting works. So it's not only music, it's not only the visual, it's any type of protected work or related subject matters. And this is what makes it extremely dangerous.
Thank you. Joe?
Just briefly, the previous speaker referred to self-regulation. And I think that a lot of these discussions are not helped by that term. And it would be nice if we could maybe work towards moving away from it. If I regulate myself, that's self-regulation. If a company regulates itself, that's self-regulation. If a company regulates me, I am not being self-regulated by that company. That company is not self-regulating me. And it does make a difference, because self-regulation in the media environment has worked. In media outlets, regulating themselves can be an effective way of regulation. Taking a term with positive connotations and making it mean something it does not mean is not helpful. It is private enforcement by internet companies. That's what it is, and that's what we should call it, because otherwise we misrepresent what we're talking about.
Thank you. Giovanni?
Just a comment. I've been listening, and I think a lot of approaches are emerging out of our discussion. I was just wondering to what extent, so there is this value gap, so which means I understand it that some people are not getting enough, which means the authors and the publisher to some extent. How to deal with that? We have seen the levy system, which has been discussed, but if we have that system, then we don't need the negligence any longer, because everything will be distributed without problems. And then if you have this system also, I think the new kind of business model, Spotify, etc., will also have little space. I think they will die probably. So this kind of new business model are in a way parasitic on the existing of copyright. So if you take out the copyright or you made a levy system, what will happen with that? So this would be a first kind of consideration that I have. And then concerning the negligence, with negligence, as we know, there are two kinds of issues. First of all, there is this kind of incentive to what is called some kind of collateral censorship, taking out everything which has some chance of being considered illegal. And then negligence would be negligence rule would be an incentive for the development of content edification technologies, because if we don't use the technology, then you're going to be negligent probably, and this will be we go against the kind of idea that such technologies are not okay on the basis of certain human rights considerations. So seems to me, I just wanted to point to some possible conflicts among the various suggestions that have been emerging out of our meeting.
Andrea?
Well, I invite you to take a look to the position of the Fair Internet Alliance, which is an alliance of performers all along Europe, which represents 36 collecting societies of performers and some part of the industries, which propose to introduce a fair compensation for the making available to the public for performers in music, of course. I'm just talking about music, sorry. enjoy an unwaivable right to receive equitable remuneration for on-demand services. Of course, as you know, we have two different kind of rights in field: exclusive rights and remuneration rights. So it's interesting in understand if the levy should be a new levy, such this one, or a levy that changes the right from exclusive to compensation. That will change a lot how to afford the problem. In my opinion, if you jurists, lawyers, and professors take a look of the comments of the directive that are on the website fairinternet.eu, there are so many points that should be taken into account and gives the idea of what a value gap is for performers. Of course, value gap is a meaning that changes depending who take a look at it. I think that collective societies have made a huge mistake in the past. As you know, collective license are such of a royalty, a percentage of the business of somebody else. Normally for authors is about 12%. For equitable remuneration is about 2%, 4%. But is not the content, the owner of the content deciding which is the price that the user makes to the public. So if the price that the market can do of this service is too low, the value gap grows up. So the mistake that collecting societies has done in the past is not to put a minimum a flat fee of dignity that will guarantee to owners an equitable remuneration, and we will be forced the user to change the price to the public.
Cedric?
Thank you. So Giovanni said authors are not well paid, and Andrea, you said, well, performers make the case for better compensation, fair compensation. There's something common to this. I mean, there's a remark I would like to make, which is really important. Our figures are public. We repeat this all the time. Just last year, YouTube alone paid $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion to the music industry. Okay, and the thing is, then you have authors, they look at the number of streams on their music on Spotify, their videos on YouTube, and they say, I'm paid this ridiculous amount of money. This is not what we are paying them. We are paying to the entities that represent either directly the authors or performers, or other entities that in the end will pay the actual authors. So here, I mean, Giovanni was asking, how do you solve the value gap? We believe that the transparency obligations that are not Article 13, but later on in the directive, are very good, because we also would like to know where our money is going. Because we pay a lot of money, and then we're blamed for not paying authors enough. But actually, we pay a lot. We pay a lot to the people we contract with, and then we hear that authors or performers not well paid. And this is also this part of the value chain that needs to be fixed. So that's really important to mention.
Thank you. Moving on, of course, as you all know, the proposal of the European Commission is currently being debated in the European Parliament. A number of amendments has been presented. They are now being discussed. And at the beginning of March, MEP Comodini Cacia released a draft version of her forthcoming report. So I would like to ask if any of you feels like commenting on the merits of the draft report and whether it addresses some of the issues facing the value gap proposal as formulated by the European Commission. Does anyone have a view, reaction? Valeria?
Thank you. Yes, I appreciated the proposal to introduce a presumption of standing on publishers. So this is already in force in Italy, and it seems that this proposal is strictly consistent with recital 31, because in my opinion, the recital 31 is somehow disruptive. If we look at the text that has been consulted, well, in the consultation, the value gap was the center of the proposal. Then if we look at the proposal in itself, the shift is quite striking, because in recital 31 it is written that in the transition from printed to digital, publishers of press publications are facing problems in licensing the online use of their publications and recouping their investments. So this is a core issue. In the absence of a recognition of publishers of a press publication as right holders, licensing and enforcement in the digital environment is often complex and inefficient. So it seems under recital 31 that the true underlying issue is linked more to licensing and enforcement problems rather than on value gap. And in this respect, the Parliament proposal seems to be respondent to this shift. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other reactions or comments on this, Agustine?
Yeah, I particularly found interesting how she addressed the question of enforcement eventually of an exemption and limitation as a result of the application of the obligation of the technologies imposed in Article 13. So she's done something quite interesting, which has elevated, first it has elevated all the exemptions to the category of user rights, which is quite a novelty in copyright law, of course, and also in the context of this directive. The thing is that it will be only, because it's in the context of Article 13, it will be only in relation to the effects caused by the measures of Article 13. So I need to see or think more to what extent it really affects the status of the exemptions under Article 5 of the InfoSoc directive. But I found it quite good to include it, and also to take out the redress mechanisms from the internal complaint handling of the platforms. And put it outside, therefore, by member states having a specific obligation to create either a body or facilitate the redress outside the internal complaint handling. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, if we try to adopt a broader look at the discussion that has been unfolding in Europe, my question is whether the debate that we are currently seeing in Europe might also unfold elsewhere in third countries that are also thinking of reforming their copyright regimes. So whether you think that a discussion around value gap, remedying failing revenues in the publishing industry might be undertaken also elsewhere, for instance, in the United States or in a hypothetically post-Brexit United Kingdom, because at the time of adopting this directive, the UK will be still likely in the European Union, but by the time of the implementation deadline, it is not said that might be actually the case. So I would like to seek your views as to whether you think that the debate that we are seeing now in Europe might also occur or is already occurring elsewhere around the world.
Well, obviously, if you compare the local revenues of a given sector to the global revenues of a Spotify, of a Facebook, etc., you can replicate the value gap narrative everywhere. And this is what we see. So that's also really interesting to see that it's fragmented. So politicians buy this locally everywhere. So this campaign exists in US, in South Asia. We see this everywhere. Same figures, by the way, same fake figures often. Not documented, many myths when it's coming from the music industry. Now, on your question on whether it can be, the EU solutions can be replicated, I don't think the world has to copy EU's wrong policy on this. The US already did that with the Sony Bono Act. When they extended the duration of their copyright because they say, well, Europe did it, so we have to do it. So maybe it's an argument that will fly if Europe follows the direction. What we see is that, and it goes back to your previous question on our position on the report, etc. Because this campaign is so much centered, so much revolving around YouTube and Google, there were members of parliament who came to us. They wanted to understand what we're doing. And we explained the business, we explained the content recording sharing technologies, etc. It was patient. Of course, we cannot do this with all MEPs. But when we do this, they understand that first, the value gap is partly a myth. Then also see that the market can solve the solutions, etc. So in the end, we are hopeful that maybe there will be more rational decision makers who will take good solutions or that then can be copied elsewhere in Europe. So this is, I think there's a lot at stake currently in the European debate. That's a question. Where it's coming, whether or not it will be replicated also depends on how convincing the policy arguments are in the current debate.
I've already seen that in the US, shortly after the victory of Trump, the Recording Industry Association of America sent an open letter to the newly elected president speaking about a value grab and not value gap. I don't know whether grab was intended.
Obama received the same letter, and the Prime Minister of Thailand, etc. You really see this everywhere, in Australia, in New Zealand, etc. So again, if you take the overall revenue of one tech platform, and then you say, well, look, in Vietnam, we don't need this amount, of course there's a value gap. But again, this is where the debate is, partly biased, because it relies on figures which are not scientifically evidentiated.
Any views on this?
It's just a question to Cedric. Are there any countries in which you are not interested to negotiate because it doesn't work?
Well, there are countries where we don't do business currently. There are countries where the internet connectivity is so low that we don't even know what's happening there. So usually when we see a market booming, that's where the business interest comes.
Okay, that's the answer to for me. So I think we can think globally, because if we have such huge players that works all around the world, we have the same problem as copyright owners, and the risk is that some countries with the same legislation that we have, or emerging country that wants to protect copyright as we do in the EU or US, are not so strong to deal with these big colossus.
I think that it is time to wrap up the session and also the conference, and I would like to conclude with some final remarks by the panelists and the audience alike. And it is the fact that, of course, what we have discussed these couple of days, the ancillary copyright and the value gap proposals are very important, but just a part of what the Commission intends to do to realize this digital single market. There has been, the proposal for new mandatory exceptions, including text and data mining, contractual relationships with authors and performers and publishers, transparency obligations, out-of-commerce works, etc. So I would like to seek your views as to whether you think that these proposals are what Europe needs to realize a competitive digital single market in which a number of different stakeholders can thrive and flourish. Leonard, perhaps, since you bring in the startup perspective.
And thanks for putting the discussion in a wider context of the digital single market and
as you probably know, the European Commission is soon to reveal a so-called midterm review for a digital single for the digital single market. So something that perhaps with a startup-like comment we appreciated about that one of the versions of that midterm review got leaked prior to the official announcement, and that reminded us a little bit of how startups work before they release a new product. There is a beta version that gets released and tested either in a smaller community or tested with the general public, and this is a very active feedback-seeking loop where you try to get immediate feedback from your peers, how they adopt the product, and then you go back and you improve it before you release it again. So we're secretly hoping that the Commission is doing some sort of this exercise by leaking a version beforehand, already gathering some of the feedback from the stakeholders, and then look over the text once more before they release it. For those who haven't read it, there is not very much in there, as for example to the copyright directive, which is pretty much just repeating a very general statement. So perhaps this is our contribution that we can give. Startups have not been identified from the beginning as one of the major stakeholders, but I think it became clear that they are. So we would appreciate a bit more focus on this aspect of the economy, which has, as the Vice President of the Commission has said, the DSM is basically made for startups. So if we would see that in the DSM midterm review, we would be happy about that. Thanks.
Giuseppe?
Well, I don't think the upcoming reform will be significant. I think this is just the cosmetics. There is an adaptation of copyright rules to new developments in technology. In spite of strong disagreement here, I don't think at least Article 13 brings, even if it were adopted as it stands, would bring very much difference. It restates basic principles of copyright law. In my view, just to reply to one of your previous questions, it is positive insofar it shows wide reliance on data, the right to information for right holders, and the fact that at the end of the day there will have to be the development of databases on a sector-by-sector basis, and this would be the first time we could have this codified in a piece of legislation. Then, when it comes to the suitability of this regulation, very frankly, in the field of content, I don't see the digital single market coming up in the next 10, 20 years, frankly. We will have to deal with geo-blocking when it comes to movies and services for a long time, for a number of reasons. Europe is facing an identity crisis. When it comes to unity, Europe has never been as divided as it is these days, frankly. We couldn't expect the Commission to take big steps, especially now, even though I appreciate that, after the timidity of the Barroso, I would say the weakness of the second Barroso Commission, the Juncker Commission is doing something, is keeping promises at least. But when it comes to the suitability of this legislation for the growth of the technology industry and the content industry, I don't think it will have a significant impact. We are just dealing with the cosmetics.
Giancarlo?
Yes. There is a discussion that I like to do with Giuseppe, but maybe that's not the moment. I don't fully understand why our market is not ready for geo-blocking, and why I know the literature, and I don't really understand why we couldn't move forward in that direction. But we shouldn't get into that right now.
But because we don't have a single copyright title, so we always have an excellent excuse to fragment markets, because the purchasing power is different. Until recently, even the bandwidth was different. People didn't easily access to internet in the same way. The Romanians have a purchasing power that is not comparable to the Danish one, and so forth.
But my point is that you don't need to sectorialize the market. You just adjust you get rid of geo-blocking.
To the Romanian price.
Huh?
It's a race to the bottom. That's what the the right holders
here
fear.
the point is always you want to have a user-centered copyright system or a right holder-centered copyright system. My view is that we should move toward user-centered. But I had a question for the authors in this room. I mean, are you happy with Article 15? I mean, because I think you wanted to broaden a little bit the discussion about the reform. Maybe this is a topic for our next conference. Are you happy with Article 15? Because to me, it's shocking that after so many years, we didn't even try to move towards a termination clause in order to adjust the leverage power, inefficiency to the passing of time for authors. And so I really would like to hear the opinion of authors and authors association about this Article 15 and its very limited scope and the fact that we probably should at least try to introduce some sort of termination right, and it's not going to happen.
Andrea, do you want to react to this?
Yes, if you take a look to the Fair Internet Performers comments on the directive, and you see the proposed amendment to Article 15, it simplifies what is the point of authors that may individually or collectively appoint a representative organization to file such claim on their behalf, because they alone cannot do this. So they should claim individually or collectively adequate contract adjustments. I don't hear.
That doesn't imply the introduction on any type of right, any type of capacity of really having a position backed up by right, of rediscussing any type of...
I think I didn't hear nothing of what you said from here.
But anyway, your position... So I'm saying that what we have now doesn't imply the introduction on any right. There is only the possibility of request additional appropriate remuneration, request additional appropriate remuneration, if then is going to be granted. My view is that authors should have asked for something more. And this is something that was debated for a very, very long time. It's in place for 4 decades in the United States, at least a termination right, after a number of years when you really realize the value of your creation. And I'm really surprised that this is not there because there are, looking at comparative analysis examples somewhere else, and I'm really surprised that this wasn't discussed, there was not a strong lobbying activity from the authors to move in that direction and coming up with
Well, I think some owners are referring this to contracts they have signed a long time ago when the digital market was not in place, and the weaker contractual part doesn't take up a proportional revenue for this. So the points are two. The first is to statute that contractually a producer or a publisher should not treat for a usage that was not introduced in the contract, which is quite common now. And the second is to adequate these percentages in the contract. So, as you know, performers are minor sons of producers, because it's the producer that treats their right to user, for exclusive right. So the point of owners is just to have better treatment in the agreements, not just with the users, for what I know.
Right.
Did I explain myself?
You can continue the discussion in one moment because we are closing the conference. I would like to thank the panelists and the audience, and I would like to give the floor to Professor Sartor and Ula for the final remarks. So thanks to all the panelists.
it's very late. I would like to thank you, all of you, in particular those who are still present and that have been able to attend our conference to the very end. At least to me, it has been a very interesting event. I've learned really a lot, and it has been a pleasure to enjoy your company. So thanks again to everybody, and let us keep in touch and continue our discussion also after the end of the conference. So enjoy your stay in Florence, and bye-bye to everybody. Ula?
I think I have nothing to add in here, just to wish you farewell and enjoy good weather today in Florence, the rest of hours that you're here, or maybe tomorrow, and thank to everybody for coming and having very fruitful and interesting discussions. Thank you very much.